is my privilege and honor to welcome to our stage at the Louisiana Studies Conference, Lieutenant Governor Jay Dardenne.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, now Shane set this up, so this was the winning entry in the Bulwer-Lytton Vile Pun category a number of years ago. This is a contest sponsored by San Jose State University where you're supposed to write the worst opening line to the worst novel imaginable. Okay, so you understand. And this was the winner in the Vile Pun category. Falcon was her name, and she was quite the bird of prey. Sashaying past her adolescent admirers, past the kiosks where earrings longed to lay upon her lobes, and sunglasses dreamt of resting on her nose, looking to start a beautiful friendship with whomsoever caught the eye of the Maltese Falcon. So, there you have it. This is what I do in my spare time. Well, I'm really glad to be with you this evening. Welcome to Louisiana, those of you who are not from here. I'm glad to have an opportunity to visit with you about my favorite subject, which is our state, and tell you a little bit about Louisiana. To set the stage for this, I'll tell you a story. The day before Bill Clinton was elected President of the United States for the first time, I was a newly elected Republican state senator from Baton Rouge. George Bush flew into Baton Rouge on the day before the election on his way home to Houston to vote. A very enthusiastic crowd gathered at the Baton Rouge airport to greet President Bush. Most of us knew that he was not going to win the election, but it was nonetheless a very enthusiastic crowd. Before the president arrived, I befriended some of the Secret Service agents, this was long before 9/11, to kind of find out what the president's path might be when he came and went so that I could position my wife and my two boys, who were about 5 and 7 at the time, in a position where they might get to meet the president. And sure enough, he flew in on Air Force One, which is a magnificent sight, and got off the plane and walked up to the podium and made his remarks and exited by exactly the route that had been described. There was only a rope stretched out to keep the crowd back. No barricades, no other security, just a rope. Big crowd, lots of thousands of people in the audience. You can picture the scene of the crowd pressing forward, hands outstretched to shake hands with the president. And I had positioned Kathy and my boys right where they needed to be, but the crowd was such that she couldn't hold the boys, so they were simply standing there. And the president made his way down the path, and where he got to the boys, he leaned down, he shook hands with both of them, and continued on his way. So I was all fired up. The crowd thinned out, and I went and caught up with him, and I picked up Matthew, who was about 5 years old at the time. He cringes at the fact that I still tell this story, but it has a point. I said, "Matthew, isn't this great? You got to shake hands with the President of the United States." And he looked at me and said, "I got a great look at his knees." And I tell that story because that was his perspective on meeting the President of the United States. He got a great look at his knees. That's all he remembers. He saw some guy's knees. So I'm going to give you a bit of a perspective on Louisiana. You natives or you Louisianians may identify with some of this. You may understand and know all of this. Those of you who are visitors to our state may leave here, I hope, with a little bit clearer picture of why Louisiana ain't Mississippi and why Louisiana ain't any other state in the country. And it starts with a very simple premise. There is no ethnic majority in Louisiana. And to understand that and to understand how that's evolved over the years, you have to go back 3,500 years. 3,500 years ago, there was a very sophisticated society that existed in the northeastern part of Louisiana, right across I-20 from Shreveport, a little bit further up, going east, a place called Poverty Point. Poverty Point, to put it in perspective for you Louisianians, is a suburb of Epes, Louisiana, which is a suburb of Delhi, Louisiana, which is a suburb of Monroe, Louisiana. So you kind of got the picture. We're in the northeast corner of our state. Native Americans built a very structured society at Poverty Point, which was named years later for a plantation that was situated there called Poverty Plantation. They were hunters and gatherers. There's no evidence of any crops at Poverty Point, but they gathered and brought things back, and what they brought back in great abundance was dirt. millions of cubic feet of dirt. Imagine that process 3,500 years ago in homemade baskets, bringing dirt that resulted in the construction of 6 magnificent mounds, the highest in North America, that still exist to this day, not at the height that they were previously, of course. There were 5 C-shaped villages built around a common plaza, all of which is evident today. The highest mound from an aerial view, and there were no aerial views at the time, depicts a bird with wings outstretched. These people knew what they were doing. The United States Secretary of the Interior has nominated Poverty Point to be a World Heritage Site. If and when it is so designated by UNESCO next year at this time, it'll become the 22nd place in America as a World Heritage Site, joining the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, and a number of other sites. It'll be the 684th or 5th site in the world to be so designated. To put that in perspective, next on the list from America will be the Alamo. So Poverty Point's ahead of the Alamo. And we think this will happen. And when it does, it'll be a very clear reminder to us about the cultural significance that Native Americans have had on the evolution of Louisiana. So Native Americans were here before there were Aztecs, before there were Mayans, there were Louisianians. They didn't call themselves that at the time. They were joined 3,500 years ago by numerous other Native American tribes scattered throughout Louisiana, many in this very area. The Caddo tribe, the Adai Nation, Choctaw, many other tribes throughout Louisiana. If you're looking for Native Americans today, look for a casino, because on their native lands they can build casinos, and there's still evidence of where they are so paramount today. Now fast forward from those 3,500 years to the mid-1500s, when a Spaniard named De Soto discovered the Mississippi River, the Long River, as it was named by the Native Americans. De Soto came and went in the mid-1500s, and a century later a Frenchman named Robert La Salle came to explore the Mississippi River. And he got on a canoe somewhere in the northern part of America, sailed down the Mississippi, got out of his canoe south of New Orleans near Venice, Louisiana, or some say closer into where New Orleans exists today, and he planted a French flag into the earth, and he named this place Louisiana. Not for some guy named Louis and some woman named Anna, but for his boss, King Louis XIV of France, who had sent him here. Less than 50 years later, in 1698, 2 intrepid French-Canadian brothers came to explore the entire Mississippi River Valley. They started off in Mobile and went to Biloxi, moved west, and made their way to Louisiana. Their names are familiar to most in Louisiana: Iberville and Bienville. Bienville gave the first land grant in Louisiana history to a friend of his named Saint Denis. Saint Denis somehow made his way to where we sit today, to Natchitoches, Louisiana, and met with the Spanish general who controlled this neck of the woods at the time. Spain, of course, controlled what is now Texas and Mexico, so the Spaniards were already here in northwestern Louisiana. Saint Denis had the good sense to marry the granddaughter of that Spanish general and became a very successful entrepreneur here at what were the crossroads at the time of the El Camino Real, the Road of the Kings. So this Frenchman, Saint Denis, establishes Natchitoches in 1714. It is the first community west of the Mississippi, first community in Louisiana. It'll celebrate its tricentennial next year in 2014. So Bienville, meanwhile, 4 years later, led by Choctaw Indians through the Wriggleys and Lake Borgne and Bayou St. John, makes his way to what is now Jackson Square in New Orleans, the first plot of land in New Orleans, and founds New Orleans. He names it for the Duke of Orleans. And New Orleans becomes a thriving river city in this new world. And soon thereafter, in the early 1700s, began a series of immigrations by the French French aristocrats in particular who'd made a fortune in the Old World in Europe and were coming to make a second fortune in the New World. Names like Mandeville and Poydras and Delahoussaye and Delarande and Delary and Dela this and Dela that, who came to New Orleans. And they brought with them, over the course of the next several decades, 7,000 Africans who did not come voluntarily, but came in bonded indenture to their French masters. So Native Americans, Spaniards, French, Africans settle in Louisiana in the mid to late 1700s throughout that century. And the relationships that existed between them, among them, resulted in the unique Creole population that exists to this day in Louisiana and flourishes in Louisiana, but that you don't find in other states in the South or really in America. The Creole population born out of the relationships and marriages between these different cultures. The Creole population is most recognized in New Orleans, in the New Orleans area, but it stretches throughout Louisiana, very prominent in St. Landry Parish and very significant here in Natchitoches Parish, where Creole families dating back to the 1700s have thrived. In fact, the only African plantation in architectural design is in Natchitoches Parish, where many free people of color owned slaves, as was the case throughout Louisiana in the 1700s and into the 1800s. And then added to the mix was another interesting group of French people who came in the mid-1700s after the British won the French and Indian War and decided to expel all the Acadian people who lived in Nova Scotia and lived in parts of Canada. They originated in Loudainais, France, moved to Acadie in Nova Scotia and eastern Canada, and thrived until the British decided that they wanted all of these people to swear their allegiance to the British throne and forsake their Catholic faith and accept the Protestant religion. And these people said, "I don't think so." And the result was that there was an attempted genocidal expulsion of the Acadian people from Nova Scotia. It took them 9 years, from 1755 to 1764, to get to Louisiana. These people were hunters and fishermen and trappers. They were very clannish, and they were Catholic. So when they got to Louisiana, they realized that all these denizens of South Louisiana I've described to you were pretty much Catholic. They brought their Catholic faith with them from Europe. So this is nirvana for the Acadian people, and they stretched out throughout South Louisiana and became a very important part of this bubbling human gumbo that makes up the diversity and ethnic diversity of Louisiana. And then move into the early 1800s, and Thomas Jefferson becomes President of the United States, and he decides that America needs to expand westward. In order to do that, he knows that he's got to control New Orleans, because New Orleans was the gateway to the New World. Forget Ellis Island. Ellis Island was not the entry point for the people who came to the southern part of the United States. They came in through the port of New Orleans in huge numbers. And everyone recognized back then that New Orleans was the gateway to this great river that connected the New World with Canada, which, of course, was controlled by France. So they had a real keen interest in that link. So Jefferson said, I better get a hold of New Orleans. So he sent a couple of pretty sharp cookies, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, to Paris to negotiate with Napoleon for the purchase of New Orleans. Well, what ensued is really kind of a microcosm of Louisiana politics. These two guys went over there with $10 million in their pocket to buy New Orleans. But Napoleon decided he would sell them everything. So he told his negotiators, just sell these Americans whatever they want. So instead of spending $10 million, Livingston and Monroe spent almost $16 million. They wound up buying all or part of what would become 15 states in the United States for the grand sum of 3 cents an acre. Now, Neither Jefferson or Napoleon had the legal authority to enter into this transaction without the approval of their legislators, but they did it anyway. There was no title description. Nobody knew what they were buying. Nobody knew what they were selling. And the microcosm of Louisiana politics was that America borrowed the money from Great Britain to perfect the sale, and Napoleon used the proceeds of the sale to wage war against the lender. But nevertheless, the result was the biggest real estate deal in world history, which we do not call the Jefferson Purchase or the American Purchase. We call it the Louisiana Purchase, because that's what America wanted and needed to ensure its westward expansion. So the Louisiana Purchase occurred, and a short time later, as had been anticipated in the documents that sealed the transaction, Louisiana petitioned to become the 18th state in America. Now, the United States Congress did not welcome this new state with open arms. There was much debate and much discussion. Think about it. The 13 colonies in the 4 states that preceded Louisiana, along the eastern seaboard and heading into the Midwest, the Mideastern part of the country, were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They looked at Louisiana and they saw people of different color, with different skin hues, speaking different languages, worshiping a different faith. And there was a lot of debate. Maybe we don't want these guys. We just fought a war a few decades ago to get away from Europe. But cooler heads prevailed, and Louisiana became the 18th state in 1812. We celebrated our bicentennial last year. And long about that time, the new kids on the block come to Louisiana, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who are in the minority. They're not in the minority anywhere else in America at the time, or in most of America today. But when they came to Louisiana, they're the minority. And there was a lot of tension between the Europeans and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the French Catholics and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and what have you. But as fate would have it, and incidentally in New Orleans, Canal Street, the big, huge, wide Canal Street was originally a canal. That's why it's such a big, wide street. It was halfway built and then stopped and wound up being Canal Street. And in New Orleans, you Louisianians know that we refer to the land between the property you own and the street as the neutral ground, common parlance in Louisiana. Well, it was so named the neutral ground because that was what divided the European side of New Orleans from the American side of New Orleans. French Quarter side, this is the French Quarter. On the other side of the canal is the American sector, the uptown, downtown part of New Orleans, and the neutral ground was what separated them. But as would be the case, little Johnny Brown, the son of this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, had gotten a look at little Miss Marie Charbonnet, the Creole beauty, during day, and by night they got together, and so the human gumbo starts stirring even more as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant becomes a part of this Louisiana gumbo. So it's all these different ethnic groups that have come to Louisiana and retain their identity even to this day. Louisiana was different in 1812 and we're different in 2013. And obviously this is not the entire scope of ethnicity in Louisiana. There are Germans, there are Irishmen, there are Sicilians, there are Jewish families, Lebanese families in relatively large numbers in this state that all form a part of the human gumbo that makes Louisiana unique. It's what makes us an interesting place to outsiders, a wonderful place for people to visit, a wonderful place for people to live and for people to retire, which is part of my spiel in talking about Louisiana and telling people why they need to come visit here, why they need to come back, why they need to settle here, why they ultimately need to retire here. And there have been any number of relatively recent additions to this gumbo into the mid-1800s and later, and all identifiable usually in a specific geographic area, which makes it interesting as well. For example, in the southernmost part of Louisiana, ravaged by recent hurricanes, St. Bernard Parish, Plaquemines Parish, the southern part of Jefferson Parish, and even into Orleans, there's a significant Croatian population that came from the Dalmatian coast of Yugoslavia and basically became oystermen. Names like Tevic and Vunovic and Jurisic and this Vich and that Vich. For generations, Viches and sons of Viches have been oyster growers in Louisiana. And they live in that southernmost part of the state and are identifiable for their expertise in the oyster industry. There is a significant Chinese population in particularly southern Louisiana. We had the only Chinese-American sheriff in America in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana for a number of years. There has been always a significant Honduran population in the southern part of Louisiana in particular. In fact, the president of Honduras in the early 90s was a graduate of LSU. His wife was from Pineville, Louisiana. The first lady of Honduras was a Louisianian. There has been a significant Vietnamese population in Louisiana since the fall of Saigon. In fact, in the mid-1990s, about 20 years after the fall of Saigon, 9 of the 37 valedictorians of public high schools in New Orleans had Vietnamese surnames. First generation Vietnamese. Their parents came to this country unable to speak English. Their children rose to valedictorians in their high school classes. Made a very significant contribution, again, along the southern Louisiana coast in the fishing industry, and many experiences of Vietnamese doctors and lawyers who came to this country and became blue-collar workers because they could not get professional jobs, but they had a work ethic that enabled them to make a living and become very ingrained into Louisiana society. So my point here is, as you think about preserving things, and you talk about preserving things, and you talk about the folk life of Louisiana, you have to appreciate the fact that you're not going to, anywhere else in America and arguably in the world, find a population like you find in Louisiana. Every state has a diverse population. Every state has ethnic groups. The larger states clearly have large numbers of people who are not native to this country. But I would suggest to you that no state in America has a cultural identity that Louisiana has, and has a sense of preservation and a sense of celebrating the cultures that populate this state like we do. It is why we have such a reputation for our joie de vivre, our love of life, and our penchant for having fun. We're a fun-loving group of people that celebrates the respective cultures that have brought us all together. It is evident in our food, it is evident in our music, it is evident in our festivals. We only have 400 festivals in Louisiana. If something walks, crawls, flies, or swims, we have a festival to salute it, we throw it in a gumbo and eat it. And usually accompanied by some form of music. And music, incidentally, we're celebrating throughout the state this year as part of our messaging, our advertising messaging. And our brand for Louisiana is Pick Your Passion. And we have many passions I've described: food, music, our love of recreational life, and hunting and fishing and festivals. We're a passionate people. And not the least of those passions is music. And music is usually accompanied by food, so they go together very well. But when you think about the musical history of Louisiana, I want to talk for just a second about that, because it's our topic of our marketing effort, and it's something of great interest to me. In fact, I've just completed, I know it's football season, not basketball season, but I've just completed the preparation of a bracket like you would see for the NCAA tournament in a quest to identify the 64 greatest songs in Louisiana music history, either by Louisianians or about Louisiana. And I promise you that you will only find a handful of states that will be able to fill a 64-song bracket that would be recognized by people virtually all over America. because it was hard to get to 64 songs. There are a number of states that could probably do it with native performers and songs that mention their state, but it's not going to be the majority of states, I guarantee you. And it was a fun exercise. I called it the gumbo bracket. We had the roux bracket, which were songs from New Orleans, the spice bracket, which were Cajun, Zydeco, and swamp pop sounds. The rice bracket was country, rockabilly, and the lanyap bracket, which was a little bit of everything else. And it was a fun exercise, and you would be astounded to see the number of songs you're going to recognize that are about Louisiana or by Louisianians. As I said, it was one man's list. Everybody could make their own list. There's no right or wrong answer here. And obviously, I figured out on the front end who was going to get to the Final Four and had to work backwards. And in case you're interested, my Final Four from the roux bracket, New Orleans, was When the Saints Go Marching In by Louis Armstrong. From the spice bracket was Jambalaya by Hank Williams. From the rice bracket was You Are My Sunshine by Jimmy Davis. And from the lanyap bracket, which was the hardest one, was Louisiana 1927 by Randy Newman, that song that gained such national prominence after Katrina that is about the flood of 1927. So we celebrate all things cultural in Louisiana. And if a state like Louisiana can't celebrate its artistic legacy and can't think constantly about preserving things, be it Poverty Point or be it homes that were built in the 1700s and 1800s, or be it its music or its wonderful sports legacy like you can find, and I hope you'll have a chance to visit the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame, which is here in Natchitoches. It just opened 2 months ago, downtown Front Street, that beautiful Front Street that's so historic and so preserved. At the very end of the street, you'll see a brand new, magnificent, modern constructed building that probably will win a number of international architectural awards, and inside we preserve the legacy of Louisiana's tremendous athletes. And we've had a lot of them. And I'll put our all-time basketball team on the floor of Louisiana natives against any state in America who can pick their native basketball players, and we'll beat them. We'll start Bill Russell, who was born in Monroe, Louisiana, Willis Reed, Carl Malone, Elvin Hayes, Robert Parrish. That's our starting lineup. And we'll bring a little skinny white kid from Baton Rouge named Bob Pettit off the bench. And that doesn't even count our adopted sons, Shaquille O'Neal and Pete Maravich. So you can see we have a rich sports legacy that we like to preserve as well. And all of this blend of cultures makes our politics particularly interesting. And it has been over the years a fascinating study when you look at Louisiana politics. When Huey Long served in the United States Senate, a senator from Texas made a very profound statement. He said, if you think you know something about politics, you ought to go down to Louisiana and take a postgraduate course. And he was probably right, because our political history has been extremely interesting throughout the years, even before we were a state and into the time that we became a state. It started with our first governor, William C.C. Claiborne, who made it his mission to capture the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte. Lafitte plied the backwaters of Barataria Bay and gained great wealth as a privateer. He claimed his actions were legal. Others felt they were not. Claiborne decided we needed to put an end to Jean Lafitte, so he posted a sign in the French Quarter that said, $500 reward for the capture of the pirate Jean Lafitte. Those signs were ripped down in a matter of days and replaced with new signs that said $1,500 reward for the capture of Governor William C.C. Claiborne. And those stayed up, just so everybody knew who was in charge. So from our earliest days, governors of Louisiana have taken heat and been subject to great criticism. And it carried on through our long legacy of colorful politicians like Huey Long, who, when you think about his name, his career was a scant 7 years. Elected governor in 1928, elected to the United States Senate in 1930, didn't take that office until 1932. During that 2-year period, his letterhead said, "Huey P. Long, Governor and Senator-elect." And he died in a hail of bullets at the state capitol in 1935. 7 years that forever changed the landscape of Louisiana politics and American politics. From the moment of his election, our state no longer had Republicans and Democrats, blacks and whites, Northerners and Southerners, liberals and conservatives. We had longs and anti-longs. You were with him or you were against him. You were rewarded or you were punished. That's the way things went. He remains an enigma today in Louisiana political history. Some love him, some hate him. When he was governor, 8,000 miles of muddy roads in Louisiana were paved for the first time. 22,000 men working on those roads. Dozens of bridges began construction, most of which would bear his name. Free textbooks for every child in Louisiana. Before Huey, if you wanted your children educated, you had to buy their textbooks. All the while, 23 of his immediate family members were on the state payroll. He was working as a lawyer for whatever state agency was paying the most in legal fees, and he was collecting from every state employee, you professors listen to this, 10% of their paychecks, which went into his infamous deduct box, so named because it was deducted from their pay and used to support Huey's political cronies. Huey insisted there was no coercion involved. He said, "We make them pay it voluntarily." But they did. But anyway, he went on to become a United States Senator, and he had visions of becoming President of the United States, and it might have happened on the heels of the Depression. There were 8 million members of his Share the Wealth clubs all across this country. If this sounds familiar in the political debate today, he wanted to redistribute wealth. He wanted to share the wealth. And 8 million people in America thought it was a pretty good idea. And had he not lost his life in 1935, he probably would have run against Franklin Roosevelt. And who knows what might have happened in the course of American history. So Louisiana certainly made its mark politically. And I'll close by making this observation about Louisiana politics. We're probably the only state in the nation that could and would have elected a character like Huey Long, who came out of the backwoods of North Louisiana and swept through South Louisiana as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, capturing the vote of all these South Louisiana Catholics, to become a virtual dictator and have the state sit back and watch as this happen. We may be the only state in America that would have elected a gospel country singer, Jimmy Davis, as its governor on 2 occasions. We may be the only state in America that would have elected an interesting character like Edwin W. Edwards, born in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana, adopted the Catholic faith young in his life, made no qualms about bragging about his many proclivities, most of which voters would typically not find to be particularly impressive, but Louisianians did on 4 different occasions. Governor Edwards spent many of his senior moments in a federal penitentiary, only to be released a couple of years ago and returned to a virtual hero's welcome in Louisiana. Got out of prison at age 85, married a 34-year-old woman. They've just had a child. I've notified our Office of Historic Preservation. We may be the only state in America that put David Duke into a runoff to almost be governor of this state, and turned around 20-some-odd years later and elected a 30-some-odd-year-old Indian American, the first in America to be our governor. It's not going to happen most places. But it happens here because of this rich cultural mix that was there at the start and is there in 2013. And I view it very much as a strength and as an asset of Louisiana. It's what makes us special. It's what makes us unique. It's what makes us fascinating to people who look at Louisiana from beyond our borders, and hopefully as they take a close look realize that it's a wonderful cultural celebration and that we are a state that appreciates its history and cherishes its culture and understands the importance of preservation, because we do. And all you have to do is look around at the things that you're discussing today and the things that you see in Natchitoches, Louisiana, and what you will see in the French Quarter, cities across America, imagine what they would give to have an area that has been preserved as the French Quarter has been preserved for literally now centuries. And in 1718, when New Orleans was founded, little did they know that 300 years later, in 2018, that very plot of land would now be memorialized as one of the most iconic spots in the United States of America, Jackson Square. And it'll be the spotlight, we hope, of the world in 2018 when the tricentennial of this unique American city is celebrated. So we're very proud of our efforts to preserve Louisiana. I appreciate what you do and your interest not only in preservation but in folk life and in the significance of how our past prepares us for our present and trains us for our future. And I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you tonight. So have a great conference for the next couple of days. I'm going to skedaddle back to Baton Rouge, so I won't be here for the rest of your meeting, but I wish you the best and welcome you to Natchitoches and to Louisiana. Thanks.